Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hope everybody is doing well. Last weekend perspective of the year, probably the second to last show of the year. I think Aaron and I are doing one more sort of final wrap up for the year. But last weekend perspective, thanks to everybody who's been listening throughout the year and giving us feedback. Really appreciate both folks that listen to the Wednesday shows, often the interview shows, as well as the weekend perspective and my attempt to try and connect the dots between some ideas, this weird sort of 20 or 30 minute soliloquy or monologue that I do every week. So anyways, hope everybody's doing well. Hope everybody's holidays are going well. Hope everybody's getting some time off from work and spending some time with family and friends and other things like that. So anyways, want to dig into one last topic, which is sort of a look ahead topic. I'm going to do things a little bit different this year. I know usually in January we do sort of look ahead for the year. Scheduling those is sort of tricky, and we got a little bit behind scheduling them, and then you're scheduling them around people's doing holidays and stuff. So we're probably going to do those in February, which is fine because there's really not much that happens in January. We're going to try and put out some interesting shows with some interesting guests around just things that are going on. But for those of you looking for the kind of look ahead in 2025, those will probably be coming out in March in February instead of January normally. So anyways, I got to thinking, and we are a couple of years into this sort of new AI era, right? Very much the generative AI era. And, it's interesting if you kind of think about where we are. There's been a lot of really big things that have happened. Obviously, we've seen a lot of money flow into this space, VC funded money, sovereign wealth money, government subsidy money, all sorts of money. So there's been a lot of money plowed into the space. We have not necessarily seen huge sort of revenues from the companies that are associated with this, unless you are kind of the pick and shovel domain. So you are the sort of chip people. You are Broadcom and NVIDIA. You are some of the cloud providers who have probably made a pretty healthy amount of money, selling those GPUs on an hourly basis. But we haven't necessarily seen the next big thing other than really sort of ChatGPT. And so there's sort of an ongoing thing in my mind of, okay, we're a couple of years into this. I've talked about this on a number of shows, kind of like where are we in comparison to other really big trends? And what's sort of weird is I think when cloud first came along, and again, this is going back 15 years, I don't know that we necessarily knew that it was going to be as big as it was going to be. And, looking back on it, you go, oh, well, that was the obvious next thing, right? We had sort of company-owned data centers and company-owned IT, and IT was kind of structured around a certain way of focusing on stability as opposed to speed. And so if somebody came along and built something that was sort of a different economic model, but also gave you more flexibility in your business, like that was probably, eventually going to become a big deal because, those types of capabilities in which you change the economics, hopefully in a positive way, you allow more flexibility for the business, you allow new opportunities to come along. Those are the types of kind of fundamental foundational things that change markets and open up new markets and so forth. So we're here at the beginning of this sort of new AI era in which everybody has an opinion, everybody has some touch point to AI, unlike what we've had maybe over the last 15 or 20 years, or at least you didn't feel like you had as much touch point, right? You were interacting with stuff. You had things like spell checkers on your phone, and you had all sorts of stuff that was maybe doing AI behind the scenes, but it didn't necessarily feel like something that sort of everybody was going to have play a role in, which we kind of eventually kind of got to with things like cloud, and we got to with mobile and other things. So I got to thinking about this, and I'm like, okay, so even though we're a couple of years into this, we're still in the very, very early stages of this. We are still in the pre-crossing the chasm for this type of market. We are still, in the earliest of first innings, or whatever analogy you want to use. And so I got to thinking about it, and I sort of said, well, would it be useful to kind of go through an exercise of how would you think about what the next couple of years might be? And again, typically people do these exercises because they want to think about where they want to position their career, where they may want to make investments. where they could help their company, where they should avoid, what are mistakes that look like they're happening over and over again. And so I put down 5 or 6 different things that I thought were worth kind of digging into, and maybe sort of a blueprint for, how we lay out some shows in the next year. Again, 2 years, 3 years, whatever you want to call it from a timeline perspective, into this new sort of Gen AI era or AI era, whatever you want to call it. And so I thought about how I've been trying to think about this, and I thought it might be something useful to share. So the first thing I had on the list is, I think if you are looking at any environment, you're doing a wordly mapping of things. I think the first thing that you typically are going to do is you're trying to figure out. I mean, I guess the thing that you could sort of ask yourself is like, what is the game? What is the purpose of the game? What are the goals of the game? What are the rules of the game? But I don't necessarily want to do that necessarily, because I don't know that you treat this so much as a game. I mean, this is going to have human impact. It's going to have business impact. It's going to have socioeconomic impact, also political impacts and so forth. So the trying to map out exactly what game you would be playing really, I think, sort of depends on where your position is, where you're coming from. Like if you were looking at this from a politics perspective or geopolitical, like you're going to have one perspective on what the game is. If you're coming at this from the perspective of I'm looking to invest as an investor, you're going to look at it very differently. So let's skip that. But I think one of the things that you may want to look at is, what are the landscape of sort of the big players in the game, and what role do they play? So this is where we sort of get into, there will be, sort of infrastructure picks and shovel providers, right? The NVIDIAs, the Broadcoms, the ARMs, the people that are providing chips, people that are providing, things like servers, so the Dells and the HPs of the world and Supermicros and so forth. So there's a lot of that we've talked about a lot, right? And you can say, kind of who are the biggest players? You can look at Google's and Amazon's and OpenAI's and all those kind of folks. I think the next thing to figure out, though, from the landscape of players in the game is, where are there places where, I don't want to say just like where disruption will happen, but where are the secondary players, and why do they exist? What's the purpose of those secondary players? Do they exist because they play a role that fills certain niches, right? So people that are, for example, like Aaron and I just finished doing a rundown of the year. There are people like, let's say, Run AI, right? A company that got acquired by NVIDIA. So why did that necessarily happen? Was there a niche that they filled that couldn't necessarily come from something that already exists today, right? So their niche was, they kind of provided dynamic infrastructure, Kubernetes related stuff for AI. And so there's going to be some niches like that. There's going to be companies who specialize in security around this, so that you have less hallucinations or your data is less vulnerable. So you're ultimately kind of trying to figure that out. And there are plenty of those sort of landscapes that are out there. I'll try and put some in the show notes. But the hard thing to figure out is, typically you can see the biggest 20 or 30 players in the market, right? And those aren't hard to figure out. They're the cloud providers, the chip providers, some of the biggest VCs and so forth. But I think the more interesting thing becomes, what are the second sort of tier and third sort of tier? Because those are the ones that, in some extent, they're going to fill in gaps that the biggest people don't focus on. They're going to focus on smaller level things that they have domain expertise in. But then you're also going to, have people that are, going to kind of be potentially incumbent disruptors, right? And so those are sort of hard to find. So that first map, I think, is somewhat helpful, because it gives you some idea of what's the concentration of the biggest players, what's their scope, how far do they kind of, their tentacles go out, and then where are the biggest concentrations of sort of these sort of second tier or niche types of players, right? So that's the first thing I tend to look at. The second thing is, what are the potential moats that are going to be around this space, right? And moats being things that provide, significant buffer or competitive differentiation for the thing that you do, for your business, for what you do. And the moats typically are going to be around, in some cases, technology. You have sort of unique, differentiated technology that nobody else has. So, for example, this is a space where there's a lot of discussion about, are there moats around large language models, right? And this is, kind of if you had gone back 2 or 3 years, you would have said, oh, OpenAI has, a distinct technological advantage. They probably have a moat around, GPT 3.5 or GPT 4. I think what we've seen is over the last year in particular, maybe the last year and a half, the moat around purely technology for the LLMs doesn't seem to be nearly as deep as it used to be, right? So that's one aspect of what you might look at. In some cases, it's economics is the moat, right? And so this is where, we're seeing so much of the discussion around the companies that have raised the largest amounts of money, or the companies that have the largest amount of capital to continue to train large models, acquire the largest amounts of chips to build these gigantic clusters. But the question becomes is that going to be a widespread moat, or is that going to be, a moat that's specific to certain things? So, for example, is the moat that Google, for example, is trying to build around their AI story, is that mostly to protect their search business? Is that to allow them to get into new things? Will that be a huge extension of their cloud business, for example? Does that help them, grow market share, for example, of things like Android versus the iPhone, right? Can they create a new experience there? Is there AI aspects that are going to help YouTube, for example, make a huge dent in the media market and streaming media and in how people do those sorts of things? So, I think that's another aspect you're looking at. The third piece that seems to be very important in this space is sort of the moat of people, right? And we've seen this, especially throughout this year, is there is a huge ongoing race to try and acquire as many of the best data scientists, especially the people that have expertise in building these things. And this is an interesting sort of thing going on because, again, it goes back to, if the LLMs can't necessarily be the moat, is acquiring all the people necessarily a moat, right? And this is where we're sort of seeing this thing where if you went back 7, 8 years, so many of these people that are the kind of the core engineers, at least today, we're working at the 3 or 4 sort of centers of gravity, right? Whether it was Google Brain, Google DeepMind, they were working at OpenAI, or maybe they were working at Facebook, and they were working on other things, but they were building the foundation of what these things have become. So, you start to look at that and you go, okay, to be successful, do you need to, be acquiring all sorts of the smartest people, or, is what they were working on get diffused out into other stuff, right? And then you start to look at other stuff that are very much difficult for individuals and even companies to sort of wrap their heads around. But things like, our political policy is going to be the moat, right? Will the EU AI Act be a moat for something? Will, the US government's perspective on, say, open source create some sort of moat or anti-moat, if you will? Or does geographic type of things, come into play in terms of creating moat? So, does it matter where the AI is going to be deployed? Does it matter, where certain aspects of this are going to be? Will it be very different things happening in one region versus the other? And does the regionality impact that? So that's another big piece that I think is worth considering is what are the moats, and is it clear what the moats will be, right? Next thing I had on the list in terms of trying to figure this stuff out is what are the economics of this technology shift, right? So, for example, we talk all the time about, sort of the perceived economics of what AI is supposed to do for you. And I think at the most basic sense, the question becomes, do you think about AI as an augmentation of what you do, right? So whatever your job might be, let's say you are a research scientist, or you are a marketer, or you are a, whatever you might be, lots of different jobs all over the spectrum. What could AI do for you, right? Or if you were to sit down and say, hey, what are all the things that I do, and where would it be nice to sort of augment that with something that's smarter, faster, offloads stuff that you want to do? What does that look like? And then the flip side of that is, what do the economics look like of replacing the people with some autonomous system that goes off and does these sort of things? So that feels like one of the economics that people have to figure out is how much of the discussion of value in AI is going to be around people, and then how much of it's going to be around creating new value or new actions or new whatever that you don't put in the context of like people doing the work versus somebody else doing the work. And I don't know that we necessarily have a great framework yet for how to look at that. I think there are people that are making some initial attempts at trying to do this stuff, and they're measuring them in those contexts, right? Like, okay, we did this thing, and our close rate for mortgage inquiries was 30% better, and that led to whatever it led to, or we were able to service 10 times as many inbound calls into our call center because AI took care of again 90% of what they did, right? So there's some aspect of that, but I do feel like there's probably going to be a different sort of way of thinking about how you measure ROI and what the economic impact is going to be. And I don't know that we necessarily have a great framework for how to necessarily think about that. Because right now, like I said, it feels very much like either an augmentation, productivity gain, or an elimination of people for the benefit of, cheaper labor being, sort of AI robotic type of things. So that's an area that I think still has a lot of work to do. Next thing I had on my list was something that, I've talked about a number of times in this show. I've talked about it in a couple of other podcasts, is like, what are the usage patterns, right? What are the things that we're going to start seeing become regular, everyday types of things, right? The same way that, having a daily stand-up, kind of how do we do software development in an agile way has become a regular usage pattern. How do we do ideation for new ideas that marketing teams work on, right? There are patterns for how that works. I think the question about usage patterns for AI is still feels like it's very individualized. Everybody's kind of trying to figure out like, what could I do? Just read a really interesting newsletter from Richard Schroeder, who's one of the product managers over at Google, somebody I think we've had on the show before, where he laid out and he said, hey, this is 8 areas I'm expecting that AI is going to make my doing my job somewhat better, right? And it was everything from, creating things to sort of having a co-pilot for certain things to, having it go off and do research on stuff. And it was an interesting framework to think about, 5 or 6 or 7 areas. And I think the interesting thing beyond that becomes, okay, once you start trying to apply the technology to these number of areas that you identify that you could try and do better, can you turn those into repeatable workflows? Or are you sort of taking on the burden of AI as a secondary type of thing, right? Like you're having to maintain it and feed it and do all those sort of things. So I think those are all still kind of being figured out. And again, it feels like they're very much being figured out on an individual level as opposed to like a group level, a team level, anything in which, maybe the measurement of what you do is at a bigger level, right? So I think there's a lot of work to do in that space. The next thing I had on my list, and this is something that we look at for sort of every new technology and every technology shift, is the majority of new technologies tend to come from, initial use cases or initial adoption is very consumer centric, right? Sort of consumer use cases. And that doesn't mean that there's nothing from a business perspective that happens, but it's very easy to sort of go like, how would I make this better from a day-to-day perspective? Could this help me, do scheduling for my kids' sporting events, easier, whatever. And they become a little more complicated in the enterprise space because again, the sort of business and enterprise space is just, it's a more complicated world. It's a more complicated set of problems. It's a more complicated organizational chart to sort of break down and make changes to. You've got big centers of culture that are, wanting things to stay the same, and you're sort of fighting against that or dealing with that. So I think the thing that we always try and look at is how quickly will the patterns that happen in consumer space, things that people do on an individual basis or kind of in the consumer space, how quickly will those patterns or that push to replicate that inside of your business world, how quickly will that happen? And, this is where we've seen, in the past, could you use mobile phones for work? Could you bring in a personal laptop, right? Sort of bring your own device type of thing. Could we get Wi-Fi into the office so that I, don't always have to, I could work out of conference room. I could work with my coworker, I'm not necessarily have to be tethered to an Ethernet. We've seen these sort of shifts happen before. Like how quickly could we get, like a Wikipedia where people can update stuff into the business as opposed to it just being, Wikipedia, the consumer thing. So I think that'll be a very interesting trend to watch. I think we're beginning to see some early entrants in that, but we're also starting to see the earliest, simplest use cases starting to run into some sort of typical enterprise bumps and backlash. How do we secure that data? Who's going to be in charge of it? How much does it cost? How do we negotiate a contract for these types of things? So all those things I think are being evaluated, because again, really what ends up happening is you have this push of workers saying I could do more outside of work than I can do inside of work. I feel like I'm being short shifted, or I'm not able to do as much as I could do. And how loud does that drumbeat become in terms of getting that sort of consumerization type of use case into into the enterprise, right? Last two things I had on my list. The first is what behaviors will need to change, and by change I mean sort of significant change, for this to be widely adopted, right? And again, we go back to kind of previous patterns. I think the question becomes like, until this is sort of a chicken and egg. Do we know what those patterns look like, what those behaviors look like now, and are we trying to change them with technology, or will the technology which gets adopted because it's the easiest to use, it's the most cost effective, change behaviors because people go, oh, that value is so useful, right? And it does feel like a little bit like the technology usually tends to push the behaviors to change. I think we're figuring out what those behaviors look like, right? Like how dependent should you feel with AI, right? Like how much should you be looking to replace versus how much are you looking to augment? And again, we're not necessarily doing that yet on a group basis or on a company-wide basis. We're doing that very much on a individual basis or small number of people basis. So I think a lot of that has to sort of be thought through. And then the last thing I think that everybody kind of does, and at the end of the day, all decisions are, it's sort of like the old saying, all politics is local. All decisions about technology, at some point you come back to it, especially if you're evaluating it or you're trying to understand it, is, how does this impact you? How does this impact your work, your family, your compensation? And then you also go, okay, how does this impact my company? And I think again, I think so much of what we're seeing so far has been kind of individual level evaluation, and there's tons of people doing it, and they're doing it again from their own perspective of localization. But so it'll be interesting to see where the sort of change in mindset, the change in behaviors, the change in how much can this help me, and do I want to give that away? Do I want to use this to take advantage of being able to get further ahead? Maybe that's your goal. You're trying to get promoted. You're trying to make more money. Or are you looking at it from the perspective of much more, if my expectation, my goal, my role, my ambition is very much at a bigger level. It's at a company level. It's at a group level, whatever that be. And how aggressively are you pushing for things beyond individual sort of impact with AI? So anyways, I think, as I look back on a lot of this stuff, I think to a certain extent, if I boiled this all down, it is, have a sense of what the board looks like, if you will, what the game board looks like, who are the big players, what are the second tier sort of orders of how are people organizing around things, what does it look like, are the most important things that can get fixed, and then look for those gaps that people aren't paying attention to, but you may inherently know are important. Look at where the economics are shifting around this, right? Where do we begin to see not just sort of 1x, 2x sort of changes, but like 10x, 5x, 10x, 20x sort of changes, whether that's improvement in speed or reduction in cost or reduction in complexity or whatever those things might be. So start to understand where do the economics of all this sort of shake out, and then begin to look at what are the behavioral things that are beyond much more than just individuals. I think as you think about how does it impact groups, how does it impact companies, how does it impact potentially entire industries or the interaction between groups and industries. I think those are the three maybe big areas that I would consider spending a lot of time looking at. The technology, will always be interesting. The technology will always be changing. There'll always be nuance in there. But I think sort of historically, we've always seen that the technologies all eventually sort of blur together. The nuance between one technology and another, unless it's absolutely the biggest moat, ends up being sort of the lesser of the thing that you totally have to keep up with. But if you're able to keep up with the other parts of it, how it impacts people, how it impacts industry, and how it impacts sort of the bigger competitive or structural way in which technology impacts business, I think those are the areas that if you think deeply about them, you think about how they affect you, but also impact bigger number of people, you'll have a better sense of how do I start to think about this as a big change in the industry. So anyways, with that, I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you all for spending little bits of your weekend with me, or Mondays or Tuesdays, whenever you happen to listen to the show. Thank you for putting up with a number of these being maybe a little rambly. I don't know if this one was rambly, but I know there are probably definitely some that feel a little bit rambly. And again, the weekend show is always intended to be sort of trying to connect the dots between some things that may not necessarily all be interrelated, but feel like there is a through line between them. So again, thanks for your feedback. Thanks for listening to the show. Thanks for telling a friend about the show. Thanks for helping us grow it. And again, hope you all have a great new year, great end of year, and we look forward to spending some time with you in 2025.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.